When I was still practicing, men didn't come to me when things were good. They came when something had already gone wrong, terribly, silently wrong. Now that I'm retired, I found myself thinking more often about the things I wish I had told them earlier. The truths I had to learn the hard way, not in medical school, not through textbooks, but by sitting across from thousands of men, year after year, watching them slowly fall apart without ever understanding why. Let me tell you something that may sting a little. Most men don't realize the price they're paying until they've already paid it in full. Some learn the hard way after their marriage breaks down for reasons they can't name. Others after a sudden hospital scare, or when their body begins to betray them in quiet but cruel ways. But for the vast majority, the toll is collected in silence, in symptoms too subtle to notice until they've taken hold. Fatigue that won't lift, a sense of numbness creeping in, a flicker of shame when the lights go off at night. I've spent over 30 years as a physician in men's health. I've worked with young men in their 30s trying to find their footing, and men in their 90s clinging to whatever sense of dignity remained. But if there's one truth that binds them all, one that haunts me the most, it's this: nobody ever taught them how to be men as they aged. They were taught how to work hard, how to make money, how to grit their teeth and suppress their emotions. But when their body began to change, when their energy dipped, when desire turned into confusion or shame, they had no roadmap. No one told them that the most intimate habits they've formed in their youth, habits they kept private, even from their partners, could, over time, quietly shape the trajectory of their health, their confidence, and their relationships. I remember one man in particular. He was 68, divorced twice, sitting across from me in my office in Oregon. He said, "Doc, I haven't felt like a man in years, and I don't even know what that means anymore." He wasn't broken physically, his tests were mostly fine. But you could see it in his posture, in the way he avoided eye contact. In the tired way he said the word man, like it no longer belonged to him. I asked him one simple question. When was the last time you felt fully alive? He couldn't answer, and that's what broke me. Because I've seen that same lost look in the eyes of too many men. Men who once felt powerful in their bodies, now unsure of what their body was even for anymore. Men who turned to habits like masturbation not out of lust, but out of loneliness. Out of habit. Out of a desperate need to feel something, anything, in a life that had grown increasingly numb. And here's the brutal truth, the part nobody wants to say out loud. It's not the act itself that hurts you. It's the why behind it. And the silence that surrounds it. Most men were never taught that the body doesn't forget. That how you treat it, what you ignore, what you hide, what you shame gets stored deep in the bones, in the tissues, in the mind. That something as routine, as personal, as unspoken as masturbation could reflect much more than desire. It could reveal need, neglect, isolation, emotional hunger masked as a physical urge. I've had grown men, tough men, sit in my office with tears in their eyes when they realized no one had ever explained any of this to them. Not their father, not their teachers, not their doctor. And now, after decades, they're living in the shadow of what they didn't know. This isn't a lecture. I'm not here to judge. I'm not here to tell you what to do or how often to do it. I'm here to help you understand. Because what you don't know will hurt you. And worse, it may already be doing so. That's why I created this video. Because even in retirement, I can't shake the feeling that there are still too many men walking around in the dark. Ashamed to ask questions, ashamed to feel what they feel. And yet desperate for someone to speak to them with truth, respect, and no damn sugarcoating. So let me be that voice. In this series, I'm going to share 4 powerful truth secrets, really that I've learned over a lifetime in medicine. They're not tricks. They're not supplements. They are understandings that can change the way you relate to your body, your desires, your energy, your manhood itself. Some of them may challenge you, some may even offend you. But every single one of them has saved lives, restored marriages, reversed shame, and helped men reclaim a part of themselves they thought was long gone. And I promise you this, if you stay with me to the end, you will not leave unchanged. Before we go on, I ask just one thing: if this message speaks to you even a little. If you recognize yourself in anything I've said, hit subscribe. Support this channel, not for me, but for yourself. For the version of you that still believes growth is possible, that still wants to feel alive again. Now, let me ask you something personal. Something no one's ever asked you, perhaps. When was the last time you touched yourself, not out of boredom or habit, but because you actually knew what you were feeling? Think about it. Question for you. Which statement feels more true for you right now? I've never thought about what my habits might say about my emotional needs. B. I've always suspected there was more to it, but I didn't know how to ask. Type A or B in the comments below. Let me know where you're starting from. Because wherever you are, we begin there, and what comes next may just change everything. When men came into my office, they rarely started by talking about emotions. They talked about symptoms, trouble sleeping, lack of energy, difficulty focusing. Some mentioned a fading interest in sex, while others described an almost compulsive need for it, something mechanical, joyless, done out of habit more than desire. But over time I learned that these weren't just physical issues, they were messages. And the body was simply speaking the language it knew best. I spent over 3 decades as a physician listening to what men were really saying between the lines. And one thing kept showing up again and again. The most private behaviors often reveal the most private pain. Let me speak plainly. Masturbation is not just a release. It is not just a habit. It's a mirror. A window into the mind. Into what we suppress, what we crave, what we're afraid to admit even to ourselves. When a man touches himself, it is never just about physical relief. Not really. It's about something deeper. And what I began to see, patient after patient, was that the reasons men gave for doing it, I can't sleep. It helps with stress. It's just routine often masks something more profound. Loneliness, disconnection, emotional silence. I remember a patient, Michael, 71 years old, retired firefighter from Phoenix. A tough man, proud, stoic. He chuckled when he admitted he still masturbated almost daily. "Doc, I know it's weird at my age," he said, avoiding my eyes, but it wasn't weird. What was telling was how quickly he moved to justify it, to downplay it. I didn't judge him. I leaned in, looked him in the eye, and asked, "Michael, do you know why you do it?" He fell quiet. His laugh faded. And then he said something I've never forgotten. "It's the only time I feel like I'm not completely alone." That hit me hard. Because I realized in that moment, for so many men this private ritual isn't about sex at all. It's about survival. About staying tethered to something, anything that reminds them they're still human. You see, as men, we're taught to value function over feeling. We measure our worth in what we do, not in what we feel. And so when emotional needs arise, when we feel grief, anxiety, fear, desire, we often don't have the tools to meet them directly. So the body does what it can. It finds a shortcut. It reaches for something familiar, something soothing, something that doesn't ask questions. But the body keeps score. And over time, these unconscious responses begin to leave their mark, not just on our health, but on our sense of identity. The tragedy is not that men masturbate. The tragedy is that they do it blindly, without understanding what's underneath the urge. Many of my patients had no idea that their patterns of self-pleasure were tied to unresolved emotions. They didn't know that late-night sessions were often about numbing pain, or that post-argument habits were about regaining control. They didn't see that what they called just blowing off steam was sometimes the body's cry for connection, or self-worth, or even grief that had never been fully processed. As a doctor, I never told men to stop. That was never the point. The point was always to ask, why now? Why this? And what else might I be feeling? Because when you start asking those questions, everything changes. You begin to notice patterns. You start to connect your physical behavior with emotional rhythms. And most importantly, you give yourself the power to respond with awareness, not just reaction. One of the most powerful shifts I've seen in my patients came not from medication, not from strict behavioral regimens, but from something much simpler, curiosity. The moment they stopped judging their impulses and started listening to them, really listening, they began to reclaim their relationship with their bodies. There is a strange dignity in that. In pausing long enough to ask yourself, what am I truly needing right now? Comfort, intimacy, relief from anxiety, a sense of control? And sometimes the answer is still to touch yourself. But when it comes from a place of compassion, not compulsion, the act transforms. It becomes not just a moment of relief, but a moment of reconnection. What I wish more men knew is this: your private habits are not shameful, but they are meaningful. And they deserve your attention. Not your guilt, not your fear, your attention. Because when something becomes a habit, when it becomes automatic, mindless, it's easy to lose the thread of why it started in the first place. And over time, what was once a source of grounding can become a mask hiding emotional hunger, covering unspoken wounds. I believe that understanding your relationship with your body is one of the greatest gifts you can give yourself, especially as you age, because aging doesn't have to mean disconnection. It doesn't have to mean withdrawal. It can mean depth, insight, peace. But that peace begins with honesty. And honesty begins by asking the hard questions. I'll leave you with one I used to ask my patients near the end of our sessions. If you weren't allowed to numb yourself tonight, what would you feel instead? Most couldn't answer right away. But the ones who stuck with that question, who let it sit in their bones, often came back changed. Not because they stopped the behavior, but because they finally understood it. And once you understand something, it no longer controls you. You get to choose. That is power. That is healing, and it starts right here. So I ask you, when you close your eyes tonight and that familiar urge arises, will you react automatically, or will you pause and ask yourself what you really need? That single moment of pause can change everything. And that's where we begin to move not just toward control, but toward wholeness. Because it's not just a habit. It never was. It's a language your body has been speaking all along. Maybe now is the time to start listening. Back when I was still practicing medicine, I used to say something to my patients that often caught them off guard. Your prostate keeps a record of your life, I tell them. Most would chuckle, assuming I was making a joke. But I wasn't. I was dead serious. And I said it because I'd seen over and over again how this small, often overlooked gland quietly reflects the way a man has treated his body, especially his sexual health, over the course of decades. The truth is, most men don't start thinking about their prostate until it starts causing them trouble. By the time they walk into a clinic with discomfort, urgency, weak flow, or worse, it's already been whispering for years, only no one was listening. And it breaks my heart to see how many of them believe their symptoms were just a normal part of aging, when in fact much of it could have been prevented if someone had simply told them the truth earlier. So let me tell you now, as plainly as I can, your prostate is not just some ticking time bomb that suddenly goes bad after 60. It is a living, responsive part of your body. It adapts, it reacts, and yes, it remembers. It remembers the long stretches of sexual inactivity followed by sudden bursts of overexertion. It remembers years of built-up tension, pressure, and inflammation. It remembers whether you treated it with rhythm and respect, or neglect. I remember a patient named Bill, 68 years old, a retired truck driver from Idaho. He came into my office terrified. He'd found blood in his urine and was having difficulty starting and finishing urination. There was discomfort, even pain, during ejaculation. Naturally, he feared cancer and I couldn't blame him. We ran the tests. Thankfully, it wasn't cancer. But his prostate was inflamed and enlarged, badly so. When I asked him about his habits, his face turned red. I went years without anything, he muttered. No sex, no release, then one day I just started again. Almost like I was trying to catch up. His body didn't thank him for it. In fact, it rebelled. What most men don't know is that the prostate isn't designed for extremes. It thrives on moderate, consistent activity, on movement, on balance. It is not meant to sit stagnant, nor is it meant to be pushed beyond its limits with erratic, compulsive behavior. And yet, this is what I've seen time and time again. Men who either ignore this part of themselves entirely or turn to it only when driven by anxiety, stress, or shame. Both extremes leave a mark. You see, the prostate is deeply tied to your sexual rhythm, and by rhythm I don't mean frequency alone. I mean the way your body engages with itself, the consistency, the intention, the awareness behind your actions. When that rhythm is off, the prostate suffers. I've had patients who went months, even years, without ejaculation. Some did it for religious reasons, others simply because life got in the way. And many thought they were doing something healthy by abstaining. But here's the science. Regular, moderate ejaculation helps clear out the prostate. It reduces congestion. It improves circulation. It flushes inflammatory toxins. And yes, there's evidence to suggest it may lower the risk of prostate cancer. But it's not just about quantity. Too much can irritate the gland, especially when done in a compulsive, tense, or disconnected way. That's why I always recommended a middle path 2 to 4 times a week for most men, done mindfully, without guilt or urgency, because that's the other side of the equation. Guilt and shame are terrible companions to the body. When men engage with themselves from a place of secrecy or anxiety, it sends signals of stress throughout the nervous system. And that stress compounds often landing, quite literally, in the prostate. What I want you to understand is this: the body is not mechanical, it is emotional. Biological, yes, but deeply intertwined with the mind and the spirit. The prostate is not just a gland, it's a messenger. It reflects not just how often you engage with your sexuality, but how you do it, and why. And if you've never heard this before, you're not alone. Most of my patients were never told that their prostate health was within their control. They thought it was genetic or inevitable. They didn't realize that their habits from their 20s onward were shaping the function of this small but powerful gland that would one day play a massive role in their comfort, confidence, and vitality. I think of another man, Robert 73, a quiet widower from Ohio. He told me he'd stopped all sexual activity after his wife passed away. For years, he simply shut that part of himself down. He didn't think it mattered anymore. But when the symptoms began: discomfort, frequent urination at night, that gnawing pressure he couldn't quite explain, he came to see me. And when I gently suggested that reintroducing regular gentle stimulation might actually help his prostate, he looked at me like I told him to climb Mount Everest. But he tried, and slowly things began to shift. The symptoms eased. More importantly, he began to feel connected to his body again, not just as a machine, but as a living, feeling part of himself. That's the lesson I wish every man knew. Your prostate is not your enemy. It's your barometer. It's telling you whether your life is in balance or not. And if you've been ignoring it, punishing it, or simply misunderstanding it, I promise you it's not too late to change. Start by listening. Not just to the discomfort, but to the rhythms of your life. Ask yourself, am I caring for this part of me with respect? Or am I using it as an outlet for stress, shame, or self-disgust? You don't have to be perfect. You don't need a rigid schedule. But you do need to pay attention. You need to remember that this part of your body is speaking to you and has been for years. Now, as an old doctor who has seen far too many men suffer needlessly, let me say this clearly: you have more control than you think. Not through pills or procedures, but through presence, through moderation, through honest engagement with your body, not just as something to fix, but something to care for. Because your prostate has kept the record. And it's not too late to start writing a better ending. Most men don't even know it exists. And if they've heard of it, they think it's something only women need to worry about. That's the tragic irony. Because in all my years as a physician specializing in men's health, I've come to realize that the most powerful, most overlooked group of muscles in a man's aging body isn't in his arms or legs, it's buried deep within his pelvis. The pelvic floor. When I first began my practice decades ago, I'll admit I didn't talk to my male patients about it either. It wasn't in the textbooks. It certainly wasn't in medical school lectures. The pelvic floor was seen as a women's issue, something relevant to childbirth or incontinence. No one ever suggested that it had anything to do with male vitality, sexual health, or even emotional well-being. They were wrong. The pelvic floor is not just a cluster of muscles hidden beneath the surface. It's the silent foundation of a man's core strength, sexual control, and urinary function. And like every muscle in the body, it ages, it weakens, it atrophies when ignored. But unlike a weak bicep or a stiff back, when this part of the body begins to fail, the losses are not just physical. They're personal. They touch a man's confidence, his dignity, his sense of self. I remember a patient named Leonard. He was 74, a retired structural engineer from Chicago. He came to me not with complaints of pain, but with something harder to name. "Doc," he said, "I'm not in pain, but something doesn't feel right. I don't feel like myself anymore." That sentence stayed with me. I don't feel like myself anymore. He wasn't referring to a specific symptom. He was describing a slow erosion, a fading connection to his own body. He told me his erections weren't as strong, his orgasms felt muted, and more recently he'd started noticing small leaks after urination. Not enough to alarm him. Just enough to humiliate him. "I feel like I'm disappearing," he said quietly. We ran tests. His heart was healthy. His testosterone, surprisingly stable. But one thing stood out: his pelvic floor muscles were severely weakened. Years of sitting at desks, in cars, at dinner tables combined with decades of clenching during moments of stress had left these essential muscles dormant and unresponsive. No one had ever told him they existed, much less that he needed to care for them. And that's the reality for most men. They grow up flexing their arms, measuring their chests, tracking their steps. But no one ever tells them that the tiny, Hidden muscles deep within their pelvis are just as important, if not more, for how they function, how they age, and how they feel. The pelvic floor is responsible for more than you think. It controls urination. It plays a major role in holding and sustaining an erection. It allows for the strength and timing of ejaculation. It contributes to the intensity of climax and the feeling of release. It's even involved in posture and spinal alignment. And when it weakens, the consequences can be devastating, not because they're fatal, but because they're silent, embarrassing, and deeply personal. A man might start noticing a slow drip after he thinks he's done urinating. He might lose the firmness he once had during intimacy. Or worse, he might begin to avoid intimacy altogether, not because he lacks desire, but because he's afraid of what might not work the way it used to. And this avoidance, this quiet withdrawal, is what truly wounds the soul. It's what causes men to shrink inside their marriages, to pull away from their partners, to stop seeing themselves as whole, sexual beings. But here's the good news, the kind of news I wish every man could hear at 40. Instead of 70, it's never too late to strengthen the pelvic floor. These muscles, like any others, respond to attention, to movement, to intention. Simple exercises, ones that require no equipment, no gym memberships, no pills, can reverse years of neglect. I've seen it time and time again. Men in their 60s and 70s who started doing basic pelvic floor exercises, what some might know as Kegels, regained not just control over their bladder, but over their confidence, their energy, their ability to feel again. Leonard, for example, took it seriously. I gave him a daily routine, nothing dramatic. Just a few sets of contractions each morning and evening, tighten, hold, release. Over time, he began to notice changes. First, fewer leaks. Then stronger erections. Eventually, a return of something he hadn't felt in years. Satisfaction. 6 months later, he came back to my office with a quiet smile. "Doc," he said, "I didn't think I'd ever feel that again, but I did. It wasn't a miracle. It was physiology and attention, and a willingness to reconnect with a part of his body that had been ignored for far too long." So if you're reading this and wondering whether your struggles might be tied to something more than just aging, the answer is very likely yes. If you've been feeling less sensation, if your orgasms are duller, if you leak a little, if you feel just a bit less like yourself, it may not be your testosterone. It may not be your heart. It may be your pelvic floor. And you can do something about it. Start by becoming aware of those muscles. You can find them by stopping the flow of urine midstream. That squeeze you feel, that's your pelvic floor at work. Begin practicing short sets of tightening and releasing throughout the day, not obsessively, just consistently. It's not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming present. Your body, even now, wants to heal. It wants to function. It wants to respond, but it needs your partnership. I've spent a lifetime watching men lose parts of themselves, not because they were broken, but because they were never taught how to maintain the most vital parts of their masculinity. The pelvic floor may be hidden, but its power is undeniable. And reclaiming it can be the first step in reclaiming so much more: dignity, confidence, intimacy, and that quiet, powerful sense of being yourself again. You don't need to disappear with age. You just need to return to the parts of you that were never given a name but were always yours to protect. In all my decades as a physician, I've treated thousands of men from all walks of life, from different cultures, with different beliefs and backgrounds. But there's one thing that has affected nearly every man I've worked with. It wasn't a disease. It wasn't low testosterone. It wasn't aging, nor genetics. It was something far more insidious, far more damaging, because it was invisible. It was shame. Shame has a way of crawling into the most private corners of a man's life. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It hides. It grows in silence. And before you know it, it begins to shape the way a man sees his body, his worth, and his ability to love or be loved. I've sat across from countless men who were perfectly healthy on paper, but deeply broken on the inside. Men who had lived for decades believing that their natural desires, their private behaviors, even their curiosity about their own bodies, were somehow dirty, weak, or unmanly. And no one had ever told them otherwise. It's heartbreaking, really. We raise boys to be tough, to hide their emotions, to never cry. We don't talk to them about sex in a way that honors its depth or complexity. And when they grow into men, they carry that silence like a wound. They learn to keep their questions locked up. They assume that being a man means figuring it all out alone. One of the most powerful stories that stayed with me came from a man named Walter. He was 69 years old, married for over 45 years, and he had come to see me not because of any physical complaint, but because he felt lost. That was the word he used. Lost, not sick. Not weak, just quietly, painfully lost. He told me that for years, decades, really he had been masturbating in secret. He wasn't addicted. He wasn't compulsive. He just didn't know what else to do with the feelings he couldn't express. He still loved his wife deeply, but their intimacy had changed over the years. Health issues, hormonal shifts, emotional distance. He never blamed her, but he blamed himself. He thought something was wrong with him. I felt broken, he told me. Not because I had needs, but because I thought I wasn't allowed to have them. He had spent years hiding. Not just the act, but the confusion, the guilt, the aching desire to feel connected again. He thought that if he told his wife, she would be disgusted. That she would reject him. That she would see him as less of a man. But here's what happened. After our session, I gently encouraged him to talk to her, not about the act, but about the feelings underneath it, about the loneliness, the longing, the vulnerability he had never dared to show her. He did, and to his astonishment, she didn't pull away. She leaned in. They talked. Really talked. For the first time in years, they held each other not just physically, but emotionally. It wasn't a fairy tale transformation. It was raw, sometimes uncomfortable, but it was real, and it was healing. Later, he came back to my office with tears in his eyes. I thought telling her would break us, he said, but it saved us. That's the thing about shame, it isolates. It convinces you that you're the only one who feels the way you do. That no one would understand. That if people really knew you, they'd leave. So you hide, you shrink, you perform. You keep secrets, even in the most sacred parts of your life, your relationships, your marriage, your self-image. And over time, those secrets start to erode your sense of intimacy. Not just with your partner, but with yourself. I've seen it in men who stopped initiating affection because they were afraid of rejection. I've seen it in men who gave up on intimacy altogether because they felt unworthy. I've seen it in men who spent their entire lives trying to fix themselves for feelings that were never broken to begin with. The tragedy is that these men weren't suffering from a sexual problem. They were suffering from emotional isolation. And that's why I say this not as a doctor reading from a chart, but as a man who has sat with other men in their most vulnerable moments. Shame is the real disease. It kills intimacy. It corrodes trust. It robs men of their right to feel fully human. But here's the good news. Shame only thrives in silence. And once you start speaking, once you begin telling the truth, not just about what you do, but about how you feel, that silence begins to lose its grip. I've watched marriages turn around not because sex was restored, but because honesty was. I've seen men stand taller, speak more clearly, and reconnect with their partners, not because they solved everything, but because they finally stopped hiding. You see, masturbation is not the enemy. Sexuality is not the enemy. Needing touch, craving connection, feeling longing, these are not signs of failure. They are signs that you are still alive. What breaks men isn't the act. It's the silence wrapped around it, the secrecy, the shame. And when you strip that shame away, when you begin to approach your own body with respect, with curiosity, with compassion, you begin to reclaim a part of yourself that never should have been lost in the first place. You become whole again. And in doing so, you give permission to others, your partner, your children, your friends, to do the same. I often say that the greatest act of courage in a man's life isn't what he does in the world. It's what he's willing to face inside himself. So if you're still carrying shame about your body, your habits, your desires, know this: it's never too late to let it go. You don't need to confess to the world. But you do need to be honest with yourself. And if you're in a relationship, you need to begin having the conversations you've been avoiding. Not with blame. Not with fear, but with honesty and care. Because when you do, you may find what Walter found, not rejection, but recognition. Not disgust, but deep human connection. That's the power of breaking the silence, and that's the real beginning of healing. As I look back on everything I've shared with you, not just as a retired doctor, but as a man who has listened, studied, and lived through the struggles of thousands of others, I want to leave you with something deeper than facts or advice. I want to leave you with a sense of truth, a truth that's rarely spoken in public, But that sits quietly in the heart of so many men, especially as they age. We are not taught how to age well as men. We're taught how to build, how to endure, how to stay quiet and push through. But no one tells us how to soften without losing strength. No one tells us how to stay curious about ourselves when our bodies begin to change. No one tells us that silence can be more damaging than any physical condition. This is why I created this message. Not to shame anyone, not to sensationalize what is natural, but to remind you, you are not alone. The feelings you've carried in secret, the doubts, the quiet fears about your masculinity, your body, your worth, they are more common than you realize, and they are nothing to be ashamed of. We spoke about 4 important truths. First, that masturbation is more than just a habit, it's a reflection of emotional needs that often go unspoken. Second, that the prostate isn't just a medical issue. It's a record keeper of your relationship with yourself. Third, that your pelvic floor, though invisible to the eye, is one of the strongest determinants of how confident and in control you feel. And finally, perhaps most importantly, that shame is the real disease. It eats away at intimacy, dignity, and identity, not because of what you do, but because of what you keep hidden. The men I've treated over the years who found real healing weren't the ones who were physically the strongest. They were the ones who were willing to ask, to listen, and to face their inner world with honesty. They dared to rewrite the story they'd been told, that aging meant decline, that sexuality ended at 60, that self-pleasure was shameful, and that silence was strength. Those men discovered something incredible, that it's never too late to reconnect with your body, your partner, or your sense of self. So what's the lesson? The lesson is that healing doesn't begin in the clinic. It begins in the mind, in the courage to ask, why do I feel this way? In the willingness to explore your needs without guilt. In the decision to speak first to yourself, then maybe to someone else. You don't have to fix everything overnight. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to care enough to pay attention. To treat your own experience not as something shameful to hide, but as something meaningful to understand. If there's one thing I hope you take from all of this, it's this: you still have time. Time to change how you relate to yourself. Time to repair what silence may have damaged. Time to discover new depth in your relationships. Time to experience not just health, but peace. Because peace comes not from having all the answers, but from finally asking the right questions. And now I'd like to ask you one. Which of the 4 truths we explored today resonated with you the most, and why? Was it about the emotional meaning behind your habits, the care of your prostate, the strength of your pelvic floor, or the weight of hidden shame? Please feel free to share your answer in the comments. You don't need to write a long explanation, a simple letter or word will do, but your voice matters. And your experience could help someone else feel seen. If you found value in this message, please consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss future content designed to support you on your journey. And if you're in a position to support this work, even with a small donation, it would mean the world. I may be retired, but I'm not done. I still believe in using my time to give back, to uplift, and to pass on what I've learned. Your support, whether by sharing, commenting, subscribing, or donating, helps me continue creating content that matters. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And above all, thank you for choosing to care for yourself and for others.